Hello all, and welcome back to Tangents on Cracked Spines. My apologies, I have a sinus infection, so this will not be the best narration. If you're new here, I'm glad you're here, but maybe go back 9 episodes to start this story from the beginning. As a quick intro, I'm Frankie, and we'll be reading with unedited personal commentary on the classics, or, in reality, any story in the public domain. Listener discretion is advised, as some of the content holds adult themes and language. I'm also known to use the odd explicative, though I'm trying to stop. The Invisible Man is making that difficult. Which we are currently reading. In the last episode, he proves to be an even worse character. Apparently it's difficult to walk when you're invisible because you can't see your own feet. Did you know that walking around London in, the beginning of a blizzard is cold and uncomfortable? And that if you're invisible, you're bound to get hurt in a crowd because nobody knows you're there. Also, dogs can still smell you, and if you've got, mud on your feet from walking around barefoot, the odd child might notice that there are muddy feet not attached to anything roaming around. He also then tries to steal clothes and food from a 19th century department store, and fails miserably at it because rather than stash the clothes somewhere and then wait until it opens to a hustle and bustle, and then, getting dressed and just sneaking out with the crowds, he decides to get dressed while there's no one there, and when people show up, they're like, "Hey, who are you? You're stealing stuff." And Scooby-Doo chase scene, except much more violent because this guy has no impulse control. So he winds up disrobing to avoid getting caught and going back out into the January weather. Stark naked. He also then realizes at some point during all of this that when he blew up his lab, he also destroyed all of his possessions in a fire. Still does not think twice about the other tenants in his building, but at least it finally dawns on him that, oh hey, I was impulsive and now I own nothing. And Dr. Kemp was rightly horrified that he blew up his house. And we begin, or resume, rather, with Chapter 23, In Drury Lane. Do you know the Muffin Man? That is not how this chapter begins. That is my own thing. Because apparently, in seeing this, my brain immediately went there and I looked it up, and apparently, Drury Lane was known for, having muffin men and other sorts of artisans, while also being kind of slummy, and muffin men being, just that, like a milkman, a baker who brought muffins to your door every day or week or whatever your delivery was. There's also a random, conspiracy theory that it was a warning about a serial killer. But that's not founded. But it's an interesting, rabbit hole to go down. Anyways, we begin! Great way to start with a tangent. My apologies to your ears. My voice. "But you begin now to realize," said the Invisible Man, "the full disadvantage of my condition. I had no shelter, no covering. To get clothing was to forgo all my advantage. To make myself a strange and terrible thing. I was fasting, for to eat, to fill myself with unassimilated matter, would be to become grotesquely visible again." "I never thought of that," said Kemp. "Nor had I. And the snow had warned me of other dangers. I could not go abroad in snow. It would settle on me and expose me. Rain, too, would make me a watery outline, a glistening surface of a man, a bubble. So you just wind up being one of the specters in the area, because Lord knows that was a very, superstitious time. And fog, I should be like a fainter bubble in a fog, a surface, a greasy glimmer of humanity. Moreover, as I went abroad, in the London air, I gathered dirt about my ankles, floating smuts and dust upon my skin. I did not know how long it would be before I should become visible from that cause also. But I also saw clearly it could not be for long. Not in London, at any rate. I went into the slums towards Great Portland Street and found myself at the end of the street in which I had lodged. I did not go that way because of the crowd halfway down, and opposite to the still smoking ruins of the house I had fired. Notice, he's still not remorseful. I'm pretty sure he's a sociopath. My most immediate problem was to get clothing. Well, if you had any kind of forethought, maybe you would have found white clothing and maybe turned that invisible before going invisible yourself. But for a supposedly intelligent man, you're very dumb. What to do with my face puzzled me. Then I saw in one of those little miscellaneous shops, news, sweets, toys, stationery, belated Christmas tomfoolery, and so forth, an array of masks and noses. I realized that problem was solved. In a flash I saw my course. I turned about, no longer aimless, and went, circuitously, in order to avoid the busy ways, toward the back streets of the North Strand. For I remembered, though not very distinctly where, that some theatrical costumers had shops in the district. So, it kind of is funny that he goes with a mask, because I feel like most versions of cinematic Invisible Man show him as wearing, like, makeup or, like, mummified wraps. And he's wearing, like, a children's mask. The day was cold, with a nipping wind down the northward running streets. I walked fast to avoid being overtaken. Every crossing was a danger, every passenger a thing to watch alertly. Oh, by the way, if you hear a random whirr in the background, it's my space heater, because I am cold. One man, as I was about to pass him at the top of Bedford Street, turned upon me abruptly and came into me, sending me into the road and almost under the wheel of a passing hansom. Again, what do you expect when you're invisible? The verdict of the cab rank was that he had some sort of stroke. I was so unnerved by this encounter that I went into Covent Garden Market and sat down for some time in a quiet corner by a stall of violets, panting and trembling. Huh. And you weren't worried you'd get settled? I found I had caught a fresh cold. I feel you there, honey, but you have a terrible immune system, but it also might be from streaking in January. And had to turn out after a time lest my sneezes should attract attention. As they always seem to. Apparently, you've got quite a sneeze. At last, I reached the object of my quest. A dirty, fly-blown little shop in the byway near Drury Lane, with a window full of tinsel robes, sham jewels, wigs, slippers, dominoes, and theatrical photographs. The shop was old-fashioned and low and dark, and the house rose above it for 4 stories, dark and dismal. I peered through the window and, seeing no one within, entered. Now, mind you, Dr. Kemp is still listening to this man. Or, listening to this story. From a robe. That's all he sees, is his robe. I mean, seriously, could you imagine hearing this fantastical, selfish story from your dressing gown? Sorry, anyways. I peered through the window and, seeing no one within, entered. The opening of the door set a clanking bell ringing. I left it open and walked around a bare costume stand, into a corner behind a cheval glass. For a minute or so, no one came. Then I heard heavy feet striding across the room, and a man appeared down the shop. My plans were now perfectly definite. I proposed to make my way into the house, secrete myself upstairs, watch my opportunity, and when everything was quiet, rummage out a wig, mask, spectacles, and costume, and go into the world, perhaps a grotesque, but still a credible figure. And incidentally, of course, I could rob the house of any available money. Again, there he goes to thievery. This is why he wanted to be invisible. He wanted to be a thief. But his cold kind of makes that hard. But at least this time he figured out that he should, wait till it was quiet and then get his stuff and then leave. The man who had just entered the shop was a short, slight, haunched, beetle-brown man with long arms and very short bandy legs. How long ago was this that he's got this much detail? I don't think I would be able to tell a story in this detail from my own life. Apparently, I had interrupted a meal. That doesn't surprise me. You're a selfish foot. He stared about the shop with an expression of expectation. This gave way to surprise, and then to anger as he saw the shop empty. "Damn the boys," he said. He went to stare up and down the street. He came in again in a minute, kicked the door to with his foot spitefully, and went muttering back to the house door. I came forward to follow him, and at the noise of my movement, he stopped dead. I did so too, startled by his quickness of ear. He slammed the house door in my face. I stood hesitating. Suddenly I heard his quick footsteps returning, and the door reopened. He stood looking about the shop like one who was still not satisfied. Then, murmuring to himself, he examined the back of the counter and peered behind some fixtures. Then he stood, doubtful. He had left the house door open, and I slipped into the inner room. It was a queer little room, poorly furnished, with a number of big masks in the corner. On the table was his belated breakfast, and it was a confoundedly exasperating thing for me, Kemp, to have to sniff his coffee and stand watching while he came in and resumed his meal. Completely off topic, but I am not the only queer person at my work, but I tend to use that word, and everybody is like, "Oh, you used a bad word." And I'm like, I am queer. It is not bad if I use it to describe myself, and because I use it as my self-descriptor, you may also use it. I could never. Well, I'm not telling you my other, all of my identities. I use queer as a, hey, I am not cis-het, woman. Like, I identify as part of the LGBT community. How I identify is not your, problem. Oh, well, you're gay. No, I am queer. I am not gay. Well, what's the difference? It opens a whole can of worms that I really should stop identifying as queer at work, because I don't want to have to explain myself to all these old white people. And his table manners were irritating. 3 doors opened into the little room, one going upstairs and one down, but they were all shut. I could not get out of the room while he was there. I could scarcely move because of his alertness, and there was a drought down my back. Twice I strangled a sneeze just in time. I kind of like the karma of him having to watch somebody else eat. And also the fact that he couldn't move or anything, because he's such a terrible person. The spectacular quality of my sensations was curious and novel, but for all that I was heartily tired and angry long before he had done his eating. Well, yeah, that seems to be your default state. But at last he made an end, and putting his beggarly crockery on the black tin tray upon which he had his teapot, and gathering all the crumbs up on the mustard-stained cloth, he took the whole lot of things after him. His burden prevented his shutting the door behind him, as he would have done. I never saw such a man for shutting doors. And I followed him into a very dirty underground kitchen and scullery. I had the pleasure of seeing him begin to wash up, and then, finding no good in keeping down there, and the brick floor being cold on my feet, I returned upstairs and sat in his chair by the fire. Again, does he not think of this man coming back and going to sit down? It was burning low, and scarcely thinking, I put on a little coal. The noise of this brought him up at once, and he stood aglare. He peered about the room and was within an ace of touching me. Even after that examination, he scarcely seemed satisfied. He stopped in the doorway and took a final inspection before he went down. I waited in the little parlor for an age, and at last he came up and opened the upstairs door. I just managed to get by him. On the staircase, he stopped suddenly, so that I very nearly blundered into him. He stood looking back right into my face and listening. I could have sworn, he said, his long, hairy hand pulling at his lower lip. His eye went up and down the staircase. Then he grunted and went on up again. His hand was on the handle of a door, and then he stopped again with the same puzzled anger on his face. He was becoming aware of the faint sounds of my movements about him. The man must have had diabolically acute hearing. He suddenly flashed into rage. "If there's anyone in this house," he cried with an oath, and left the thread unfinished. He put his hand in his pocket, failed to find what he wanted, and, rushing past me, went blunderingly, noisily, and pugnaciously downstairs. Oh, you mean you actually moved out of the way of him? But I did not follow him. I sat on the head of the staircase until his return. Presently he came up again, still muttering. He opened the door of the room, and before I could enter, slammed it in my face. I think he needs better reflexes. I resolved to explore the house and spent some time in doing so as noiselessly as possible. The house was very old and tumble down, damp so that the paper in the attics was peeling from the walls, and rat-infested. My dear man, you did say that you went to the slums. What did you expect? Especially considering you admitted to yourself that you lived in the slums. He's got some nerve. Some of the door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. Several rooms I did inspect were unfinished, and others were littered with the theatrical lumber bought second-hand, I judged, from its appearance. In one room next to his, I found a lot of old clothes. I began rooting among these, and in my eagerness forgot again the evident sharpness of his ears. I heard a stealthy footstep and, looking up just in time, saw him peering in at the tumbled heap and holding an old-fashioned revolver in his hand. I stood perfectly still while he stared about, open-mouthed and suspicious. "It must have been her," he said slowly. "Damn her." I love how he's, suspicious of whoever this mysterious her is and, street urchins, but, not assuming that any of the noise is the rat infestation he apparently has. He shut the door quietly, and immediately I heard the key turn in the lock. Ha ha. Then his footsteps retreated. I realized abruptly that I was locked in. For a minute, I did not know what to do. I walked from door to window and back and stood perplexed. A gust of anger came upon me, like that's anything new. But I decided to inspect the clothes before I did anything further. Oh, really? You thought first? Wow. And my first attempt brought down a pile from an upper shelf. This brought him back, more sinister than ever. That time, he actually touched me, jumped back with amazement, and stood astonished in the middle of the room. Presently, he calmed a little. "Rats," he said in an undertone, fingers on lips. He was evidently a little scared. It's about time he thought of rats. I edged quietly out of the room, but a plank creaked, and the infernal little brutes started going all over the house, revolver in hand, and locking door after door and pocketing the keys. When I realized what he was up to, I had a fit of rage. Again, like it's anything new. I could hardly control myself sufficiently to watch my opportunity. By this time, I knew he was alone in the house, so I made no more ado, but knocked him on the head. "Knocked him on the head?" exclaimed Kemp. "Yes, stunned him as he was going downstairs. Hit him from behind with a stool that stood on the landing." "You heard him on the stairs? My God." "He went downstairs like a bag of old boots." "But I say, the common conventions of humanity are all very well for common people. But the point was, Kemp, that I had to get out of the house in a disguise without his seeing me. I couldn't think of any other way of doing it. Because you are a brute, you... Brr. And then I gagged him with a Louis Cortez vest and tied him up in a sheet." "Tied him up in a sheet?" "Made a sort of bag of it. It was rather a good idea to keep the idiot scared and quiet, and a devilish hard thing to get out of. Head away from the string." "You are a terrible person." "My dear Kemp, it's no good you're sitting glaring as though I was a murderer. It had to be done. He had his revolver. If once he saw me, he would be able to describe me." "But still," said Kemp, "in England today, and the man was in his own house, and you were, robbing. At least Kemp has some sense of a moral compass." "Robbing? Confound it! You'll call me a thief next." "Maybe because you are?" "Surely, Kemp, you're not fool enough to dance on the old strings. Can't you see my position?" "And his, too," said Kemp. The invisible man stood up sharply. I like Kemp. Still don't like Griffin. "What do you mean to say?" Kemp's face grew a trifle hard. He was about to speak and checked himself. "I suppose, after all," he said with a sudden change of manner, probably because he realizes the man is prone to fits, "the thing had to be done. You were in a fix, but still, of course I was in a fix, an infernal fix. He made me wild, too, hunting me about the house, fooling about with his revolver, locking and unlocking doors. He was simply exasperating. You don't blame me, do you? You don't blame me?" "Anybody would blame you. You were in somebody else's house. He had every right."
I never blame anyone, said Kemp. It's quite out of fashion. What did you do next? Kemp is being very political here. I was hungry. Downstairs I found a loaf and some rank cheese, more than sufficient to satisfy my hunger. I took some brandy and water, and then went up past my impromptu bag. He was still lying quite still. To the room containing the old clothes. This looked out upon the street, two lace curtains, brown with dirt, guarding the window. I went and peered out through their interstices. Outside the day was bright, by contrast with the brown shadows of the dismal house, in which I found myself, dazzlingly bright. A brisk traffic was going by, fruit carts, a hansom, a four-wheeler, with a pile of boxes, a fishmonger's cart. I turned with spots of color swimming before my eyes to the shadowy fixtures behind me. My excitement was giving place to clear apprehension of my position again. The room was full of a faint scent of benzoline, used, I suppose, in cleaning the garments. I began a systematic search of the place. I should judge the hunchback had been alone in the house for some time. He was a curious person. Everything that could possibly be of service to me I collected in the closed storeroom, and then I made a deliberate selection. I found a handbag I thought a suitable possession, and some powder, rouge, and sticking plaster. Oh, so he does use makeup. I had thought of painting and powdering my face, and all that there was to show of me, in order to render myself visible. But the disadvantage of this lay in the fact that I should require turpentine and other appliances and a considerable amount of time before I could vanish again. Finally, I chose a mask of the better type, slightly grotesque, but not more so than many human beings, dark glasses, grayish whiskers, and a wig. I could find no underclothing, but that I could buy subsequently, and for the time I swathed myself in calico dominoes and some white cashmere scarves. You're legitimately stealing the best things from him, and then you plan on buying undergarments with the money you've stolen from him. I highly dislike you, man. I hope you meet with a dismal end. I could find no socks, but the hunchback's boots were rather a loose fit and sufficed. In a desk in the shop were 3 sovereigns and about 30 shillings worth of silver, and in a locked cupboard I burst in the inner room were 8 pounds in gold. I could go forth into the world again equipped. Dude, you literally stole everything of worth from this man, and you see nothing wrong with it. You have no conscience. Then came a curious hesitation. Was my appearance really credible? That's what you're worried about?
Sorry, people, but there will be no end to my calling him terrible names. Unless there is in the book some complete 180 in his personality, which I doubt. I tried myself with a little bedroom looking glass, inspected myself from every point of view to discover any forgotten chink, but it all seemed sound. I was grotesque to the theatrical pitch, a stage miser, but I was certainly not a physical impossibility. Gathering confidence, I took my looking glass down into the shop, pulled down the shop blinds, and surveyed myself from every point of view with the help of the cheval glass in the corner. I spent some minutes screwing up my courage, and then unblocked the shop door and marched out into the street, leaving the little man to get out of his sheet again when he liked. So you have no idea whether he's actually alive or whether you killed him with that hit, which I have every belief you could have done. In 5 minutes, a dozen turnings intervened convened between me and the customer's shop. No one appeared to notice me very pointedly. That's because even back then, people don't care about others. They were too busy doing their own thing. My last difficulty seemed overcome. He stopped again. "And you troubled no more about the hunchback?" said Kemp. "No," said the Invisible Man, "nor have I heard what became of him. I suppose he untied himself or kicked himself out. The knots were pretty tight." The knots were pretty tight. You're an idiot. He became silent and went to the window and stared out. "What happened when you went out into the Strand?" "Oh, disillusionment again. I thought my troubles were over. Practically, I thought I had impunity to do whatever I chose. Everything save to give away my secret. So I thought. Whatever I did, whatever the consequences might be, was nothing to me." That seems to be the way you live your life anyways? What changed? "I had merely to fling aside my garments and vanish. No person could hold me. I could take my money where I found it. I decided to treat myself to a sumptuous feast, and then put up at a good hotel and accumulate a new outfit of property. I felt amazingly confident. It's not particularly pleasant recalling that I was an ass. Oh, you recognize that. I went into a place and was already ordering lunch when it occurred to me that I could not eat unless I exposed my invisible face. I finished ordering the lunch, told the man I should be back in 10 minutes, and went out exasperated. I don't know if you have ever been disappointed in your appetite." "Not quite so badly," said Kemp, "but I can imagine it." "Sure you could." "I could have smashed the silly devils. At last, faint with the desire for tasteful food, I went into another place and demanded a private room. 'I am disfigured,' I said, 'badly.' They looked at me curiously, but of course it was not their affair. And so at last I got my lunch. It was not particularly well served, but it sufficed. And when I had it, I sat over a cigar, trying to plan my line of action, and outside a snowstorm was beginning." "You planned things? Since when?" "The more I thought it over, Kemp, the more I realized what a helpless absurdity an invisible man was. In a cold and dirty climate and a crowded civilized city. Before I made this mad experiment, I had dreamt of 1,000 advantages. That afternoon, it seemed all disappointment. I went over the heads of the things a man reckons desirable. No doubt invisibility made it possible to get them, but it made it impossible to enjoy them when they are got. Ambition. What is the good of pride of place when you cannot appear there? What is the good of the love of a woman when her name must needs be Delilah? I have no taste for politics, for the black guardians of fame, for philanthropy, that's obvious, for sport. What was I to do? Too bad you don't have a taste for sport. You might be able to place your aggression somewhere. And for this I had become a wrapped-up mystery, a swathed and bandaged caricature of a man." He paused, and his attitude suggested a roving glance at the window. "But how did you get to Ippin?" said Kemp, anxious to keep his guest busy talking. Yeah, because if he's talking, he's not, destroying things. "I went there to work. I had one hope. It was a half idea. I have it still. It was a full-blown idea now. A way of getting back, of restoring what I have done, when I choose. When I have done all I mean to do invisibly. And that is what I chiefly want to talk to you about now." "You went straight to Ipping?" "Yes, I had simply to get my 3 volumes of memoranda and my checkbook, my luggage and underclothing, order a quantity of chemicals to work out this idea of mine. I will show you the calculations as soon as I get my books. And then I started. Jove, I remember the snowstorm now, and the accursed bother it was to keep the snow from dampening my pasteboard nose. At the end, the day before yesterday, when they found you out, or rather, to judge by the papers,
I did, rather. Did I kill that fool of a constable? No, he's expected to recover. That's his luck, then. I clean lost my temper, the fools. Why couldn't they leave me alone? And that grocer lout. You're still blaming other people for your impulsive actions and your temper. You're a terrible human being. There are no deaths expected, said Kemp. I don't know what about that tramp of mine, said the Invisible Man with an unpleasant laugh. He's not your tramp. He's his own person. By heaven, Kemp, you don't know what rage is. To have worked for years, to have planned and plotted, and then to get some fumbling, pure-blind idiot messing across your course. You're the one who drug him into this. Every conceivable sort of silly creature that has ever been created has been sent across me. No, I think you're just an idiot with unchecked rage. And lots of narcissism. Not that I have any psychological background, so this is not a professional opinion. Ooh, I must see if any psychologist has commented on this book, because, whoo boy, I would love to see that. Hear that. If I have much more of it, I shall go wild. I shall start mowing them. Hey, you haven't already? As it is, they've made things 1,000 times more difficult. No, you have made things difficult. No doubt it's exasperating, said Kemp dryly. Alright, between that chapter being very long and the fact that I rambled a lot, and me just generally being not able to breathe, that's where we'll end for today. Thank you for listening, and now for the typical podcast business. If I was smart, I would actually make this a separate segment that I could add into each of my chapter episodes, but I'm apparently a glutton for punishment. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe and rate or review on whichever podcast app you're using. Apparently Apple Podcasts, helps get more views, but I'm happy with whatever you're doing. And while 5 stars is appreciated, even other ratings, as long as they have reviews, tell me how I can improve. Sharing this with your friends is also very welcome. You can reach out to me via email at tocspod@gmail.com. Phonetically, that is Tango, Oscar, Charlie, Sierra, Paris, Oscar, Delta @gmail.com. On Facebook at Tangents on Cracked Spines Book Club, with a voice message at anchor.fm/Tangents on Cracked Spines. Or I now have a WordPress, which is wordpress.com/Tangents on Cracked Spines. The Facebook page will have updates posted, as will the podcast, and my Tumblr, which is nameflow. They will have the updates and polls to vote on the next story. And if you're interested in merch, I made a few items for my personal Etsy shop, which I'll link in the description. Thank you all again for listening, and have a wonderful day. And hopefully stay out of having colds like I am prone to. Thank you, and bye-bye.